The keynote address is a recorded one by Dr. Bibek Debroy. So before we start that, a few words about Dr. Debroy. He's an economist who was educated in the Ramakrishna Mission School, the Presidency College in Kolkata, and the Delhi School of Economics, Trinity College in Cambridge. He is presently the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister and president of the Indian Statistical Institute. He has worked in teaching assignments in Presidency College, Kolkata, the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, Pune, the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, and as director of a Ministry of Finance UNDP project on legal reforms. He has been associated with various organizations like the NCAER, the National Council for Applied Economic Research, the Rajiv Gandhi Institute for Contemporary Studies, the PhD Chamber for Commerce and Industry, the Center for Policy Research. He has been a member of the Niti Aayog from 2015 to 2019 and is of course now the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. He has written various books on various subjects, but he is also a rail enthusiast and has chaired the high-level committee for mobilization of resources for major railway projects. It's known as the Debroy Committee for the restructuring of the railways and the Railway Board. He has received many awards during his career, some of them being the Shriram Sanlam Award for the financial journalism in 2013, the Padma Shri, the fourth highest civilian award of India in 2015, and he was also conferred with various lifetime achievement awards and conferred the title of Vachaspati by the Sri Lal Bahadur Shastri Rashtriya Sanskrit Vidyapeeth. He is an ardent rail enthusiast and of course a life member of our Rail Enthusiast Society. I would now request for his...
Thank you for inviting me to deliver this very brief talk. I'm not quite qualified to deliver this talk. There are so many other eminent people who are members of the society to deliver this talk. I may have been the chairman of the Railway Reforms Committee, so to speak, but I'm fundamentally a railway user, if that's the word to use. And there are several people who are members who are far, far more qualified than I am to talk about the Indian railways or railways in general. So I'm going to make some remarks. And those remarks need to be considered against that background of what I have said. Most of the time, when we react to a certain event, we may pretend to be objective, but we are all colored by individual subjective experiences and perceptions. So let me start with that. I was born in Shillong, which is in Meghalaya. But at that time, at that particular point in time, Shillong was part of undivided Assam. In that part of the region, with the exception primarily of Assam, railways were unknown. We had no exposure to the railways. Railways were a bit of an alien entity. And I'm mentioning this because I was not only born in Shillong, I grew up in the Northeast. And in the Northeast, where I spent the first 10 years of my existence, there was this perpetual sense of being cut off from the rest of the country. Cut off primarily because of physical connectivity. And I'm saying this not only because I work for the government, I'm saying this because of my background of growing up in the Northeast. Many people who are not familiar with the Northeast do not realize the psychological impact that there is of there now being an airport in my state, of there now being a railway station in my state. And as a continuation of that theme, I will mention the railway network being extended to Imphal. As an extension of that theme, not just Manipur, I will mention the possible expansion of a railway line to the state where I was born, namely Meghalaya, via Barnihal. So what was my first experience of the railways? My first experience of the railways, as I said, most of our travel at that time in my life used to be by road. My first experience of railways was in the vicinity of Haflong, in the vicinity of Jatinga, in the vicinity of Diffu. That entire stretch has changed. Many of the tunnels have gone. A few have been retained, but many of the tunnels have gone. So my first memory of the railways is from Diffu when I was a kid. When I was amazed, when I was standing there, we used to live in Shillong, but my father was temporarily posted in Diffu, so we were visiting him and we were taking a walk in the evening, and here was a train thundering past. And my parents encouraged me to take out a small coin and place it on the rails. And when the train had passed, lo and behold, it was completely flattened. And to me, it was an amazing experience. To me, it was an amazing experience standing there and seeing this powerful engine, what I thought was a powerful engine thundering past. And you could see the coal, or you could see the fire, especially in the night. And if you're at a station, you could see the token being thrown and the token being received. At that age, I did not understand what a token was, but it left an imprint. And there were the tunnels. And as soon as you went inside the tunnel, something would howl. And I was told these were ulluks. That time I had no idea what these ulluks were. It took me several years to figure out what these ulluks were, because ulluk to me is ullu, but it wasn't obviously an owl. So what were these things? These were the Hulong baboons, which used to frequent those parts. I remember on one of these travels, we were traveling in one of those coaches, and suddenly the engine driver came up and said hello to my father, whom my father had nothing to do with the railways, came and said hello to my father. And immediately my father went up in my esteem. Oh my God, the engine driver came and said hello to my father. The ambition of many boys of that particular generation was that when I grow up, I want to become an engine driver. Those railways that were built primarily in Assam were built with a great deal of difficulty. We don't realize today how difficult it was. As is the case with Mumbai-Pune, it was the case with that stretch. It was the case with all the hill railways, and certainly so far as the northeastern part of it is concerned, there's been a very convincing, comprehensive documentation in the book that Arup Kumar Datta wrote. If you went to Guwahati, you were less cut off. But you were still cut off because one part of it was medium gauge, the other part of it was broad gauge. And therefore, there was the ferry, the Pandu Amingao ferry. So vividly in my memory is etched this image of having to change coaches, having to cross by ferry from Pandu to Amingaon. It is one thing to realize what it was, and one thing to read about it when one reads about Karnail Singh and the Assam Link project. So my memories of rail travel are associated with these things. They're associated with sticking your head out of the window and your hair being covered with coal and soot. My memory of train travel, my nostalgia is of steam engines which had to stop once in a while to fill coal and more commonly water. And then you get down on the platform at the halt. My memory of train travel is that you can open the windows, look out at the scenes flashing in front of you. My memory of train travel is of the old first class where you had a mirror and a basin inside the first class coach. My memory of train travel much later is of traveling in much later, and you had the fans, and most of the time the fans would not work. So someone would take out a comb from his pocket, twirl it with the comb, and the fan would begin to move. Train travel has changed. Train travel is not the same. The vestibule coaches began to do it. The air conditioning began to do it. Shatabdi began to do it. Rajdhani began to do it. And today, if I'm traveling by Rajdhani, life changes. But even then, if I'm traveling by Rajdhani, train travel is not the same. The experience is not the same. Am I traveling by air? Am I traveling inside an air-conditioned car? Am I traveling by train? It makes much less of a difference. Now, I'm not trying to go back 3 decades. All I'm saying is that identification with the railways, that identification with a certain kind of travel, the identification with a certain kind of romance, it has become history. All of us have traces of nostalgia. All of us have what I may call the Alex Haley syndrome of tracing out our roots. And in that search, as much has changed. The entire shortage economy has changed. We no longer have a shortage economy. Much has changed. It is inevitable. But most of us who are interested in the heritage of the railways, and this is the problem that worries me. And I'm not trying to provoke the rail enthusiast society. And it is not a problem that I think is specific to India. It is a problem that probably happens everywhere, except in India. For various reasons, the changes have been very, very fast. In this process of transformation, and no one is saying one rolls back the wheels, in this process of transformation, the question that I don't have an answer to, and it's a rhetorical question, is I look at the average age of the rail enthusiast society. Or what is the minimum age for becoming a member of the rail enthusiast society? And does the younger generation identify with this proud and glorious legacy of the Indian Railways? And to repeat what I said, we have bullet trains, we have high-speed trains. That heritage is not necessarily a part of that. I will not get into the issues of how the railways is going to adjust to the competition. That's a separate issue. The railway board knows that better. You know it better. But what I am saying is there has been a revolution, on road transport and cars and roads. Roads are far better today. And there's been a liberalization and opening up of civil aviation. So the young today don't identify with railways in the same fashion, quite apart from the fact that the railways have changed. They don't identify with rail travel. If it is less than 400 kilometers, I'm going to go by car. If it is more than 1500 kilometers, I'm going to go by air. So one of the issues, so I'm making two different points. Point number one, there's been a change in the nature of rail travel itself, inevitable. Two, the younger generation no longer identifies with the railways as much as it used to. So how do we get them to identify with this heritage? How do we get them to identify with this heritage of the Indian railways? And it is a heritage that is remarkable. There are few countries in the world that have this heritage. I will illustrate that same problem with two different themes. They are different themes. One is literature and the second one is films. On either, whether it is literature or whether it is films, there is, of course, the English language literature, the English language films, and in films, of course, you have multiple languages. There is Bollywood, there are regional films, all of that. But let me ask you this. First on literature, let me ask you this. How many instances of fiction can you think of that have been set in the railways? Using the railways as a backdrop, how many instances of fiction can you think of? In literature, there has been a transition. Earlier, a lot of fiction used to be written in the so-called vernacular languages. I'm not talking about the vernacular languages, I'm talking about the English language. There are plenty of people in India who write fiction in the English language. How many books can you think of in fiction that have been written with the railways as a backdrop? Yes, there will be a few. You will think of Anita Nair, you will think of Manisha Rajesh, you will think of Ruskin Bond's anthology. But compare it with what has happened in Britain. I'm not talking about the US, because in the US it has always been more of freight, relatively speaking. But compared with fiction with the railways as a backdrop, including, by the way, detective fiction in Britain, how many instances can you think of in India? Not too many. And you'll find the same thing in films. Yes, there were films where the railways did figure, and incidentally, most of the original Bollywood films, the older Bollywood films, the railways used to be identified with suicides. You want to kill yourself? Let's have the railways. You will say, yes, there was Burning Train, yes, there was Chennai Express. But if you think about it, as a setting, even something like Burning Train, the golden era of the railways is over. Yes, once in a while, the railways will provide a setting. Once in a while, some exotic hill railway will provide the background, but that's about it. I'm harping on the same point of a lack of identification with the heritage. What is heritage? Well, there are the hill railways. There is Darjeeling. There is Nilgiri. There is Kalka Shimla. So there is that. But that's become an exotic thing. It's a niche. And I'm not getting into issues of how we protect that heritage and whether we have done enough to protect that heritage and whether we actually deserve UNESCO's tag of World Heritage status. I'm not getting into that. But heritage is not just that. There is heritage not only in those hill railways, there is heritage also in the museums. There is heritage also in the galleries. There is heritage also in the parks. But question, how many people go and visit the National Railway Museum? And the answer is quite a bit actually now, even the young. But how many people go and visit the Steam Museum in Rewari? And contrast that, the number of visitors in the Rewari Steam Engine Museum with the number of visitors to the privately run, privately marketed transport museum, which is a short distance away. So railways are about, the heritage is about several things. There are the bridges, there are the tunnels, and all of these, if they are being revamped in the technological process, they must be saved somewhere. So there are two questions. Three questions really. A, what is the core function of the Indian Railways? Is the core function of the Indian Railways running trains, or is the core function of the Indian Railways protecting the heritage? You'll say both. But I'm going to say there is probably a difference between the two. Look at the Archaeological Survey of India. It was supposed to undertake excavations, which it does. But it is also supposed to preserve. And look at the state of preservations of some of those historical monuments. So at the point, at the risk of aggravating people who work from the railways, the point I'm making is, I think it's worth considering whether the protection of the heritage, and heritage, as I said, is much more than the hill railways. There are all kinds of things also intangible which belong to that heritage. Is it possible to de-link it a little bit from the Indian Railways? I'm not necessarily saying make it completely private. Maybe there's a trust or something like that. So that's the first point I made. The second point I'm making is, and there's a reason why I mentioned the private transport museum in Gurgaon, or extended Gurgaon. We know that the public sector is not necessarily good at certain things. So why is it the case that the protection of that heritage must necessarily be in public hands, even if I think of a trust? Why can't it be private? And in Britain, one of the countries I know of, a large part of this preservation is undertaken by the private sector, is undertaken by citizens in general, is undertaken on the basis of funds received from citizens. This is not a problem that is specific to the railways. As Indians, we are very bad at preserving our past, at preserving our heritage, at preserving our legacy, which is sort of further vindicated by the number of tourists who come to India as compared to countries which have a far more limited cultural and historical legacy. So the second question I'm flagging, and it's a rhetorical question because I don't know what is the answer, is how can we get the private sector in? How can we even make the protection of heritage a commercial venture? I do believe it is possible to make it a commercial venture, provided I give the visitor something attractive enough, provided I give the visitor an experience that the visitor is willing to pay for. And I come to the third problem, which is the most important of all. And it's a chicken and egg thing because it goes round and round in circles. How do I get the younger generation interested? I know life expectancies have been going up across the globe. They've been growing up in India. But sooner or later, I'm not wishing you ill, but sooner or later, most of the present members of the uh, rail enthusiast society will depart upwards. To carry this heritage forward, we need the younger generation to come in. At a purely anecdotal level, I think there is plenty of interest, or I've detected plenty of interest at the level of the DRMs. Many at the DRM level, I've certainly detected a lot of interest. So, my plea to members and ex-members of the railway board is it should be possible to tap all of this interest and enthusiasm. When I say future, I obviously mean the Indian Railways, because we are talking about
Yeah,
the
fine.
Indian Railways. And I've already mentioned the threat of competition. I can talk about all kinds of things. I can talk about the modernization of stations. And all 8,000 stations cannot be modernized. But some of the impressive changes in some of these stations we will soon be able to see. In fact, they are already there, except because of COVID, people have not seen them, which is like, let's say, Habibganj. Improvements in train services, all of that is visible. But to me, there are five key issues. And if we resolve these five key issues, we will ensure the transformation of the Indian Railways. So what are those five key issues? The first issue is competition through private entry. Now, notice I'm deliberately using the expression competition through private entry. I did not use the word privatization, because privatization is used in two completely contrary senses. When I sell off the equity, I do not think that the Indian Railways will be ever in a position where you sell off the equity in the core function of running trains. You will not have private engine drivers, privately held tracks. I don't think it will ever come to that. Maybe there is an issue of selling off the production units, but leave that aside. So private entry, not privatization. You can already see the private entry. Most of the services that the railways undertakes, they are actually given to private service operators now. And not just the visible bit about the private trains if and when they run. So point number one is the private entry of competition. Point number two is decentralization. Decentralization of decision making down to the level of DRMs, even further down to the level of station masters, station superintendents. Over a period of time, I personally think that the railways in India have become excessively centralized. Now, much of the decentralization has already begun to happen. The third issue is of proper system of accounts, so that when I look at the figures, I know that the costs truly represent the way cost should be calculated. I truly know that expenditure is truly according to the norms. In the absence of it, I don't really know whether a project is truly viable or not. I don't really know what is the true operating ratio. So I must have proper accounting reforms. I've not quite kept pace with whatever has been happening in the railways, but my impression is that there was a pilot project on accounting reforms, which was first carried out in Ajmer division and was then introduced in North Zone. And it was waiting to be rolled across India everywhere, which I presume took a toss because of the COVID pandemic. So that is the third one. The fourth one is we need a proper independent regulator. And when I say independent regulator, that regulator has to be truly independent, de-linked from the Ministry of Railways. When we authored the report, we had a certain terminal goal in mind, and in that terminal goal, there is a Ministry of Railways, which oversees policy. That policy is not only for the public sector player, which Indian Railways will become, but also for private sector players. And the railway board becomes a bit like a corporate board for the Indian Railways. And the regulator becomes a bit like an umpire, like other regulators are, to ensure that the rules of competition are fairly implemented between the private players and the public players. I'm not very sure what has happened to the question of the independent regulator, but I think we do need that independent regulator. The fifth is an issue of HR. Because for any organization, I think fixing that organization requires one to fix HR and fix finances. HR, I'm not getting into messy issues of how one unifies the services with retrospective effect. That's a very complicated, messy legal issue. But prospectively, I think we need to unify the services so that we break down the silos, because apart from excessive centralization, the railways, everyone who's worked in the railways or knows about the railways knows, it works in silos. So to me, the two most important pending reforms that are there, pending, are three actually: the HR, the accounting reforms, and the regulator. Yes, I am not going to talk about the national plan that the railways have. I'm not going to talk about the electrification, the modernization, all of this, the railway stations, the tariffs, ending the cross subsidization, making freight competitive, ensuring that subsidies go to passengers who truly deserve them, transiting to a system where most people travel reserved, not unreserved, all of that. But those five, to my mind, are the five most important elements of that transition that the Indian Railways need to go through, because the competition is already there. It's not going to wait. Thank you.